You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. My name is Garrett Hollis. I'm 42 years old, and I've been living in Portland, Maine for the past decade. My girlfriend Marissa, she's 38, works remotely doing graphic design, convinced me that we needed to get out of the city for a while. We've been saving up for this 2018 Ford Transit van conversion for 2 years, and finally, we were hitting the road. Our friend Beck, this 31-year-old photographer with a wild streak, decided to tag along for the first leg of our trip. We planned to head north into New Brunswick, Canada, maybe chase the coastline and find some quiet spots to park overnight. The whole Vanlife thing seemed perfect on paper, you know? Wake up to ocean views, cook breakfast on a portable stove, live simply. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Finding places to actually sleep in your van without getting hassled is harder than it looks. We'd been on the road for 3 days when Beck suggested we try this abandoned fishing village he'd read about online. A place called Seal Cove, tucked away on the Bay of Fundy. According to some forum he found, there were old structures still standing and locals rarely visited because the area had been evacuated back in the 70s due to some industrial accident. Sounded sketchy, sure, but also kind of exciting in that stupid way things do when you're trying to have an adventure. We rolled into Seal Cove around 7 in the evening, right as the sun started dropping behind these massive pine trees. The road turned from pavement to gravel to basically just dirt and roots. Marissa kept checking her phone, but we'd lost signal about 20 minutes back. Beck was in the passenger seat, camera already out, snapping photos of the dense forest pressing in on both sides. I remember thinking the trees looked wrong somehow. Too close together, too dark underneath, like they were trying to hide something. The van's headlights cut through this weird mist that had started rolling in off the bay, and I had to slow down to maybe 15 miles per hour just to see where I was going. When we finally reached what used to be the village, it was disturbing in this quiet, gradual way. There were maybe a dozen buildings scattered around. Houses with caved-in roofs, a general store with busted windows, what looked like an old church with a steeple tilted at this impossible angle. Everything was covered in moss and vine growth, like nature was actively trying to swallow the whole place. We parked the van in front of the general store, figuring it was central enough that we could explore a bit before dark. Beck immediately jumped out, already talking about getting shots for his portfolio. Marissa seemed less enthusiastic, kept her arms crossed as she looked around at the ruins. "This place feels off," she said, and honestly, I agreed, but I wasn't about to admit it. We decided to walk around for maybe 30 minutes before settling in for the night. The ground was soft, almost spongy, and our footsteps made these weird squelching sounds even though it hadn't rained recently. Beck wandered toward the church while Marissa and I checked out a few of the houses. Most of them were empty shells, furniture rotted away, floors collapsed into basements filled with black water. But one house, this 2-story place with faded yellow siding, still had stuff inside. Personal items like whoever lived there just walked away midlife. There was a dining table with plates still set out, a coat hanging on a hook by the door, even a calendar on the wall stuck permanently on August 1977. Something about seeing that date made my skin crawl. Marissa found a photo album on a shelf, pages warped and stuck together. She managed to pry a few apart, and we saw pictures of families, kids playing by the water, normal small-town stuff. But their faces, I don't know how to explain this without sounding crazy. Their expressions seemed forced, like they were trying really hard to look happy, but couldn't quite manage it. There was this one photo of maybe 20 people gathered outside that church we'd seen, and every single person was staring directly at the camera with these tight, unnatural smiles. No one was looking at each other, just all focused on whoever was taking the picture. Marissa closed the album quickly and said we should head back to the van. I didn't argue. When we got back outside, the mist had gotten thicker, rolling through the abandoned buildings like something alive and searching. Beck was standing by the church, and when he turned toward us, his face was pale. He held up his camera and said, "You guys need to see this." We walked over, and he showed us the photos he'd just taken. Inside the church, he'd captured the sanctuary, pews still in rows, an altar at the front. But in every single photo, there were these dark shapes in the pews. Not clear enough to be people, but too defined to be shadows. In the last photo he took, right before he got freaked out and left, there was something standing at the altar. Tall, impossibly thin, with what might have been arms raised above its head. Beck deleted that last photo immediately, hands shaking, and said we needed to leave. But the sun was almost gone, and driving these roads in complete darkness seemed like a worse idea than staying put. So we climbed back into the van, locked the doors, and decided we'd just tough it out until morning. That was our first mistake. The van felt smaller once we locked ourselves inside. Marissa set up our sleeping area in the back while Beck and I tried to rationalize what he'd seen in the church. Probably just light playing tricks, I said, not believing it myself. He nodded, but kept glancing out the window toward those ruins. We made a quick dinner on our camp stove, just ramen and some canned vegetables, but none of us had much appetite. The mist outside had become so thick you couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. It pressed against the van windows like something trying to get a better look inside. Every few minutes, the whole vehicle would creak and we'd all freeze, listening. Around 9 o'clock, we heard the first sound that wasn't wind or settling metal. It came from somewhere near the church, this low, rhythmic thumping. Not like footsteps, more like someone slowly beating a drum. Thump, pause, thump, pause. Perfectly spaced, almost hypnotic. Beck grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the church, but the beam just disappeared into that dense fog. The thumping continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it started. Could be an animal, Marissa suggested, but her voice was barely a whisper. I pointed out that animals don't make sounds with that kind of regularity. We sat there in silence, listening so hard my ears started ringing, but nothing else happened for a while. I must have dozed off around 11 because I woke up to Marissa shaking my shoulder. "There's someone outside," she hissed. I sat up fast, head foggy with interrupted sleep, and followed her gaze to the driver's side window. She was right. There was a figure standing maybe 15 feet from the van, just visible through the mist. It looked like a person, average height, wearing what might have been old-fashioned clothing, but I couldn't make out any features. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there facing our van. My heart was hammering so loud I could hear in my ears. Beck had woken up too, and all three of us watched this thing for what felt like hours but was probably only a couple of minutes. Then it turned, slowly, and walked toward one of the houses. Not in a jerky or scary way, just a normal walking pace, which somehow made it worse. It disappeared into the building, and we didn't see it come out. "We should drive," Beck said, and I was already in the driver's seat before he finished the sentence. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. I tried again. Nothing. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, then died completely. "The battery can't be dead," I said, more to myself than anyone else. We'd driven just fine getting here. I'd checked all the van's systems before the trip. Marissa suggested maybe the cold affected it, but it wasn't even that cold, probably mid-50s. I popped the hood anyway, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside against every instinct screaming at me not to. The air outside felt wrong, too thick, like breathing through wet cotton. I moved to the front of the van, lifting the hood and checking the battery connections. Everything looked fine. Terminals were clean, cables were tight. Behind me, I heard Beck calling my name from inside the van, voice tight with fear. I turned around and saw what he was seeing through the windshield. There were more figures now, for maybe 5 of them, standing in a loose circle around the van. Same indistinct features, same old-fashioned clothing, same horrible stillness. They weren't approaching, just watching. I backed toward the driver's door, not taking my eyes off them. One of the figures tilted its head at an angle that didn't look quite right, too far, like its neck had extra joints. I fumbled with the door handle and practically threw myself back inside. We sat there surrounded by these things for almost an hour. It didn't move closer, didn't move away, just stood there in the mist like sentries. At some point, Marissa started crying quietly, and I held her hand but didn't know what to say. What could I say? We were trapped in our van in an abandoned village in the middle of nowhere with our phones useless and our engine dead, and these things outside that might have been people, but definitely weren't anymore. Beck kept his camera in his lap, but didn't try to take any photos. Smart. The last thing we needed was to draw their attention more than we already had. Around 1 a.m, the figures started to move. Not toward us, thank God, but away back toward the buildings. They moved in perfect synchronization, all turning at the same moment, all walking at the same pace. Within a minute, they disappeared into the ruins, and we were alone again. Or at least, we couldn't see them anymore. None of us slept after that. We took turns watching different windows, whispering theories about what those things were. Marissa thought maybe we'd somehow disturbed something by being here, like we'd trespassed on sacred ground or whatever. Beck suggested residual hauntings, energy imprints from whatever had happened in 1977. I didn't have theories. I just wanted to survive until sunrise and get the hell out. Around 4 a.m, just when the sky started showing the barest hint of light, the thumping started again. Same slow rhythm, coming from the church. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, a voice, maybe multiple voices, singing or chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The sound was beautiful and horrifying at the same time, echoing through the village and seeming to come from everywhere at once. It built in intensity, more voices joining in, until my teeth were vibrating with it. Then, right as the first rays of sunlight broke over the trees, everything stopped. Complete silence. The mist began to thin, and when I turned the key in the ignition, the van started perfectly on the first try. We didn't talk about whether to leave or not. We just moved. I threw the van into drive, while Beck and Marissa scrambled to secure everything in the back. The dirt road looked different in early morning light, less threatening, but somehow still wrong. Tree branches that hung over the path seemed to reach toward us as we passed. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see those figures following, but the village disappeared behind us into the thinning fog. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the steering wheel. Marissa kept saying, "Faster," under her breath, even though I already had the gas pedal floored as much as I dared on that rough terrain. We made it maybe 2 miles before the road just ended. Not gradually, it literally ended in a wall of dense forest that I absolutely did not remember driving through on the way in. I slammed on the brakes, and we all stared at the impassable vegetation blocking our path. "This doesn't make sense," Beck said, which was the understatement of the century. I put the van in reverse, thinking maybe we'd take a wrong turn somehow, but when I looked behind us, that wall of forest was there too. We were boxed in on a stretch of road that couldn't have been more than 50 feet long. The trees on either side pressed so close I couldn't even open the driver's door. Panic started clawing its way up my throat. This wasn't possible. Roads don't just disappear. I tried backing up anyway, hoping maybe it was some optical illusion. The van moved maybe 10 feet before the rear tires hit something solid. We lurched to a stop, and through the back windows, we could see that wall of vegetation had moved even closer. The forest was actively closing in on us. Marissa was hyperventilating in the back, and Beck started frantically Googling on his phone, which was stupid because we still had no signal. "We have to go back," I said, hating the words even as they came out. Back to Seal Cove was the last place I wanted to go, but it was the only direction that seemed open. I turned the van around in what little space we had, scraping the sides against branches that shouldn't have been there, and headed back toward the village. The mist had returned by the time we rolled back into Seal Cove, thicker than before, practically solid. I parked in the same spot by the general store because I didn't know where else to go. We sat there, trying to form a plan. Beck suggested exploring more, looking for another road out. Marissa thought we should stay in the van and wait for someone to come looking for us, which seemed optimistic given that nobody knew exactly where we were. I was about to suggest we try hiking out on foot when we heard a knock on the van side panel. Not a random sound, a deliberate knock, knock, knock. All 3 of us froze. Another knock, same rhythm, from the other side. Then the back doors. Then the front hood. Knocking from all directions, dozens of knuckles rapping against metal in this awful, synchronized pattern. I made myself look out the window. The figures were back, more than before, at least 20 of them surrounding the van. They were closer this time, close enough that I could almost make out faces through the mist. Almost, but not quite. Their features seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them. One stood directly outside my window, its hand raised to knock again. I could see the hand clearly, gray skin, fingers too long, nails broken and dark. But when I looked up to where its face should be, there was just this smudge of shadow that hurt to look at. The knocking continued for several minutes, then stopped. The figures remained, surrounding us in a tight circle. "Maybe they want something," Marissa said, voice shaking. "Maybe if we give them something, they'll let us leave." I asked what the hell we could possibly give them, and she didn't have an answer. Beck suggested trying to communicate somehow, but I shot that down immediately. Every horror story I'd ever heard ended badly when people tried to communicate with things they didn't understand. We needed to survive, not make friends. But as the morning dragged on and the figures didn't move and the mist didn't clear, I started to wonder if survival was even on the table anymore. The van's gas tank was half full. We had maybe 2 days of food and water, and we were surrounded by things that clearly weren't human anymore, but had maybe been once. Around noon, one of the figures moved. It stepped back from the circle, then walked toward the church with that same measured pace. One by one, the others followed until we were alone again. "They're inviting us," Beck said, which was the most disturbing interpretation possible, but probably accurate. The church seemed to be the center of whatever was happening here. Every weird event pointed back to it. The photos Beck took, the chanting we'd heard, now this. I knew going there was probably the worst idea possible. I also knew we didn't have many choices left. We tried leaving. The forest wouldn't let us. We could sit in the van until we ran out of supplies, or we could walk into whatever nightmare was waiting in that church and maybe find answers. Maybe find a way out. Probably just die. But at least we died doing something instead of just waiting. So I unlocked the van doors, and against every survival instinct I had, we stepped outside and started walking toward the church. The walk to the church took forever, even though it was maybe 100 yards. Every step felt wrong, like we're moving through water instead of air. The mist clung to our clothes, our skin, leaving this oily residue that made me want to scrub myself raw. Beck walked slightly ahead, camera dangling forgotten from his hand. Marissa gripped my arm so tight I could feel her fingernails through my jacket. The figures stood in a line on either side of the path leading to the church entrance, creating this horrifying honor guard. Up close, I could see details I wish I hadn't. Patches of skin that looked moldy or rotten, clothes that were decades out of style and falling apart, eyes that were either completely black or completely absent. I kept my gaze forward and kept walking. The church doors stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow us. Inside was darker than it should have been. The broken windows should have let in daylight, but the interior was almost pitch black. Beck pulled out his flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness to reveal the sanctuary. Pews arranged in neat rows, all facing an altar at the front. And in every single pew sat a figure, maybe 60 or 70 of them, all sitting perfectly still with their heads turned toward us, not looking at us exactly. Their faces were angled in our direction, but I still couldn't make out features, just that same blurred emptiness. We stood frozen in the doorway until Beck whispered, "The altar. Something's on the altar." I made myself walk down the center aisle between those pews full of things that used to be people. Marissa and Beck followed close behind, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The figures didn't move as we passed, but I could feel their attention on us like physical weight. The altar came into focus as we got closer, stone, old, with symbols carved into it that looked vaguely religious but wrong somehow, angles that didn't quite connect right. On top of the altar lay a ledger, the kind of old leather-bound book you'd see in a museum. It was open to a page filled with names written in careful script. Dozens of names, maybe hundreds, all with dates next to them. August 1977, over and over again. The same date from that calendar in the house. Beck reached for the book before I could stop him. The second his fingers touched the leather, every figure in the church moved at once. Their heads snapped forward to look straight ahead, toward the altar, toward us. The sound of 60 necks cracking in unison echoed through the church. Then they opened their mouths, all of them, together, and started that chanting we'd heard earlier. But up close, with the full force of it hitting us, I realized it wasn't a language at all. It was names. They were repeating names from the ledger in this horrible, discordant chorus. The sound built and built until I thought my skull would crack open. I grabbed Beck's arm and yanked him away from the altar, and the three of us ran for the exit. We burst out of the church and into the mist, and behind us the chanting cut off instantly. The figures from the honor guard were gone. The village seemed empty again. We stood there gasping, trying to process what had just happened. "The book," Marissa said between breaths. "Did you see the last page?" Beck shook his head. She grabbed his camera and pulled up the photos he'd taken. He'd photographed the book without realizing it. His flash had gone off automatically in the dark church. We crowded around the tiny screen, scrolling through images until we found it. The last page of the ledger had 3 new names written in that same careful script, but in fresh ink that looked wet. Garrett Hollis, Marissa Chun, Beck Palmer, our names, and next to them, a date, August 2024. That was 6 months ago. "We've been here before," I said, the realization hitting me like ice water. "We're going to be here." Or, I couldn't make sense of it, but somehow we were already part of whatever had happened to this village. The industrial accident in 1977 wasn't an accident. The evacuation wasn't an evacuation. Something had taken everyone, and now it had us too. The ledger was a record, a list of the taken, and we just added ourselves to it by coming here. "No," Beck said, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it. "No, that's bullshit. We're leaving. Right now. We'll drive through the forest if we have to. We're not staying here to become like them." We ran back to the van. I started it up, relieved when the engine caught immediately, and pointed it toward where the road should be. The forest wall was still there, but I didn't care anymore. I gunned the engine and aimed straight for it. The van crashed through the first layer of branches, metal screaming as vegetation scraped along both sides. Branches shattered the passenger window, showering Beck with glass. Marissa was screaming from the back. I kept the gas pedal down, plowing through undergrowth that should have stopped us, but somehow didn't. The van lurched and bounced, and I heard something underneath break with a grinding crunch, but we were moving forward. The trees thinned. Sunlight broke through, and suddenly we were on pavement, real pavement, with road signs and everything. I drove for 2 hours straight before I felt safe enough to stop. We ended up at a gas station outside Fredericton, and the normalcy of it, fluorescent lights, pop music on tinny speakers, a bored clerk playing on his phone, almost made me cry with relief. We bought coffee and sat at a picnic table outside, none of us speaking. We were out. We'd escaped. Beck's camera was destroyed. He'd thrown it in a trash can at the gas station without a word. His hands were shaking too badly to hold it anyway. Marissa had stopped crying, but kept touching her face like she was making sure she was still solid, still real. I felt hollow, scooped out. We decided right there that we'd never talk about Seal Cove again. Never tell anyone where we'd been. Maybe if we didn't speak about it, we could pretend it never happened. We climbed back in the van and headed south, back toward Maine, back toward our normal lives. That was 3 weeks ago. And tonight, when I looked at the calendar in our apartment, I realized what day it is. August 19th. We left Seal Cove on August 20th, 3 weeks ago. But my calendar says it's August 19th. Like we lost a day somewhere. Or like time is moving differently for us now. And this morning, I found moss growing on the bathroom wall. I didn't tell Marissa about the moss. What could I say that wouldn't sound insane? Besides, she'd been dealing with her own weird issues since we got back. She kept finding dirt under her fingernails even right after showering, and her houseplants were dying, all of them, at the same time, turning brown and brittle overnight. Beck stopped answering my calls about a week ago. His last text just said, "It followed me home," with no explanation. I drove to his apartment yesterday and found it empty, his landlord saying Beck had broken his lease and moved out without notice. No forwarding address. No goodbye. Just gone. The moss on the bathroom wall spread fast. Within 2 days, it covered half the room. I tried scrubbing it off with bleach, but it just grew back thicker. Marissa finally noticed when she went to brush her teeth and found moss growing inside her toothbrush holder. "We need to move," she said, and I agreed. But when we started packing, we realized all our photos from before the trip were missing. Our phones, our laptop, physical prints gone. Only the photos from Seal Cove remained, and we deleted those. Except they kept reappearing, filling our camera rolls, printing themselves from our printer at night. Always the same images: the church, the ledger, those figures in the pews. And in the most recent photos, the ones that appeared this morning, we could see ourselves reflected in the church windows. But our reflections weren't moving the same way we were in the pictures. They were standing still, staring out like we were looking at us from inside the church. The chanting started 3 days ago. Faint at first, like it was coming from far away or through water. But it gets louder each night. Last night, I could hear it clearly, voices singing those names from the ledger, and now they're singing our names too. Over and over. Garrett Hollis, Marissa Chun, Garrett Hollis, Marissa Chun. I went to the window to close the curtains, and there was mist outside. In Portland, Maine in August, there was that same thick, wrong mist from Seal Cove. It pressed against our apartment windows like it was testing for weak spots. Marissa won't leave the bedroom now. She says the walls in there are the only ones not growing moss yet. I brought her food, water, but she won't eat. She just sits on the bed looking at her hands. Her fingers are getting longer, I'm sure of it. Just a little bit each day, but enough that I notice. When I look in the mirror, my eyes seem darker, like the pupils are expanding to swallow the color. We're changing. Whatever we brought back from Seal Cove, it's remaking us into what we saw, what we ran from. I tried calling the police, tried explaining that we needed help, but the dispatcher couldn't understand me. My words came out garbled, mixed with that chanting language. I haven't been able to speak clearly since yesterday. Tonight, the mist filled our apartment. It came through the cracks under the doors, through the vents, through the walls themselves. I can't see Marissa anymore, even though she's only in the next room. The chanting is so loud now, it's inside my head, part of my thoughts. I try to write this down, to leave some record of what happened, but my hands won't work right anymore. The fingers are too long, the joints bend in new places. Someone will find this eventually, I think. They'll find our names in a ledger somewhere, dated August 2024, and they'll wonder what happened to us. If they're smart, they won't go looking for answers. If they're smart, they'll stay far away from abandoned places, from villages that shouldn't exist, from mist that moves with intention. I can see figures in the mist now, surrounding me, and I recognize them. They're from Seal Cove. They've come to collect. There's that tall one from the altar, and the ones that stood outside our van, and others I remember from the church pews. They're reaching for me with those two long fingers, and I know I should fight, should resist, but I'm so tired. The chanting has become my heartbeat, my breathing, my thoughts. I'm not Garrett Hollis anymore. I'm just a name in a book, a date in a ledger, another figure that will stand in the mist waiting for the next ones foolish enough to visit. I can feel myself forgetting what warmth feels like, what sunlight feels like, what it felt like to be human. In the bedroom, I hear Marissa's door open. I hear her footsteps, but they don't sound right, too measured, too synchronized with the chanting. She appears in the mist, and where my girlfriend used to be, there's just a figure with blurred features and empty eyes. She extends her hand toward me, and I take it because what else is there? We walk together into the mist, into the nothing, and the last thing I see before I forget everything is our apartment door opening on its own. The mist pours out into the hallway, seeking, searching. The ledger isn't full yet. There are still pages left to fill, still names to add, still people who will ignore warnings and chase adventures into places they shouldn't go. And we'll be there, waiting in the mist, in the village that shouldn't exist, forever adding names to that terrible book. Forever singing in voices that aren't quite human anymore. Forever. My name is Vivian Kraft. I'm 51 years old, and I live in Portland, Maine, working as a marine biologist at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. My son, Derek, he's 28, does IT consulting from wherever he can get Wi-Fi, bought himself a converted Sprinter van last year and wouldn't shut up about how life-changing it was. He'd been bugging me for months to take time off and join him for a trip, said I needed to disconnect from work and actually live a little. My daughter Simone, she's 33 and teaches high school chemistry, decided to come along too, probably to make sure Derek and I didn't kill each other since we tend to bicker. The plan was simple. Drive up the coast into New Brunswick, visit some tide pools I'd been wanting to study, and spend a week just being a family without the usual holiday obligations and strained dinner conversations. We left Portland on a Tuesday morning, Derek's van packed with camping gear, food supplies, and way too much of Simone's camera equipment. She's an amateur photographer, takes it very seriously. The drive up through Maine was gorgeous, all coastal views and lobster shacks, exactly the kind of wholesome trip I'd expected. Derek had mapped out this route that would take us through some smaller towns along the Bay of Fundy, places tourists don't usually bother with. He'd found this spot on some Vanlife forum, an old coastal access road near a place called Hopewell Cape where you could park overnight and wake up to the most incredible sunrises. Sounded perfect, and honestly, after the week I'd had dealing with budget cuts at the Institute, perfect was exactly what I needed. We crossed into New Brunswick around noon and stopped for lunch at this tiny seafood place in St. Stephen. The locals were friendly enough, though when Derek mentioned Hopewell Cape, the waitress got this weird look on her face. Lots of places to stay around there, she said carefully, but stick to the main tourist areas. Some of the old access roads got washed out during the last big storm. Dangerous to drive on. Derek assured her we'd be careful, and we finished our meal without thinking much about her warning. Looking back, I wish I'd paid more attention to how she didn't quite meet our eyes when she said it, how her hands shook just slightly as she refilled our water glasses. The drive to Hopewell Cape took about 3 hours, and the landscape got progressively more isolated as we went. Thick forests gave way to rocky coastline, and the few houses we passed looked run down, some abandoned entirely. Derek's GPS took us off the main highway onto a secondary road, then onto what was barely more than a dirt track winding through dense pine forest. Simone kept commenting on how the trees looked diseased, patches of dead needles, strange fungal growth on the trunks, branches that hung at unnatural angles like broken arms. I tried to brush it off, told her it was probably just the salt air and harsh winters, but even I could tell something was off about this forest. It felt sick, contaminated, like we were driving through the body of something dying. The access road Derek had found opened onto a small clearing right at the cliff's edge, overlooking the bay. The view was stunning. You could see for miles across dark water, dotted with small islands. But the clearing itself was strange. There were remnants of what looked like other campsites, old fire rings filled with blackened stones, discarded camping chairs rotted through, even a torn tent half buried in the dirt. Popular spot, Derek said cheerfully, but I noticed he parked the van as far from the cliff edge as possible. The drop-off was steep, maybe 80 feet down to jagged rocks and churning water. No guardrails, no warning signs, just empty space that seemed to pull at you when you got too close. We set up our camping area outside the van. Folding chairs, a portable table, Derek's ridiculous propane grill he'd insisted on bringing. Simone wandered toward the cliff edge with her camera, and I had to call her back twice because watching her that close to the drop made my stomach clench. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in oranges and purples, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Beautiful even. We cooked dinner, burgers and corn on the cob, and sat around Derek's camping lantern telling old family stories, laughing about holidays past, the kind of bonding moment I'd hoped this trip would provide. But as full darkness fell, the temperature dropped fast, and a fog started rolling in from the bay. Not unusual for coastal areas, but this fog was dense, almost solid, and it moved wrong. Not drifting with the wind, but flowing in deliberate streams, like rivers of mist following invisible channels. Derek wanted to sleep outside under the stars, but Simone and I voted for the van. The fog had gotten so thick we couldn't see 10 feet in any direction, and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below seemed louder than it should have been, almost aggressive. We climbed into the van around 10 o'clock, Derek grumbling about us being boring, but I noticed he locked all the doors carefully before settling into his sleeping bag. I took the converted bed in the back, Simone got the fold-down bench seat, and Derek stretched out in the front. The last thing I remember before drifting off was the fog pressing against the windows like hands feeling for a way in, and the distant sound of something that might have been singing or might have been the wind playing tricks. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have made Derek drive us back to the main road right then. But I was tired, and the van felt safe, and I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I woke up to Derek shaking my shoulder, his face pale in the dim light from his phone. "Mom, there's someone outside." My brain took a second to catch up. Outside where, doing what, but then I heard it too. Footsteps crunching on gravel, circling the van slowly. Deliberate steps, not rushed, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world and knew we weren't going anywhere. Simone was already awake, pressed against the far window, trying to see through the fog. "I can see a shadow," she whispered. "Just one person, I think. Maybe they need help." I told her not to open anything, not to make a sound. Something about those footsteps felt wrong. Too rhythmic, too measured, like someone marching to music only they could hear. The footsteps continued for maybe 5 minutes, completing several full circuits around the van. Then they stopped directly outside the driver's side door. We all froze, barely breathing. A hand pressed against the window. I could see the outline of fingers through the foggy glass, but they were positioned oddly, like the hand had too many joints or the fingers were bent at impossible angles. The hand stayed there for what felt like forever, just pressing gently against the window, and I had this horrible image of it suddenly punching through the glass and grabbing whoever was closest. Then it withdrew, and the footsteps resumed, moving away from the van toward the cliff edge. Derek grabbed his flashlight and aimed it out the window, but the beam just died in the fog, showing us nothing. "We should leave," Simone said, and I agreed. But when Derek tried to start the van, the engine turned over once, then died completely. He tried again, nothing. Not even the dashboard lights came on. "Battery can't be dead," he muttered, popping the hood release. I grabbed his arm before he could get out. "Don't," I said. "Just wait until morning." He argued that we couldn't just sit here trapped, that we needed to at least check what was wrong, but I wouldn't let go of his arm. Some primitive part of my brain was screaming that going outside right now, for any reason, would be the last thing any of us ever did. We compromised by waiting, watching, listening for whoever or whatever had been circling us. An hour passed in tense silence. The fog outside seemed to glow faintly with its own light. Not enough to see by, but enough to notice. Around midnight, we heard voices, multiple voices, all speaking in unison like a creepy chorus. They weren't close, maybe 50 yards away near where the forest met the clearing, but they were loud enough that we could make out individual words. Except the words didn't make sense. They sounded like English, but the sentences were backwards or inside out. Grammar completely destroyed. "The water holds memory, the rocks remember falling, the sky will drown us all," stuff like that, on and on in this flat monotone that made my teeth ache. Simone started crying quietly, and I pulled her close, trying to comfort her while my own hand shook. The voices continued until the first hint of dawn light started breaking through the fog. Then they stopped mid-sentence, cutting off so abruptly it was like someone had flipped a switch. The sudden silence was almost worse than the voices had been. Derek tried the van again, and this time it started perfectly, engine purring like nothing had ever been wrong. He looked at me, and I could see my own fear reflected in his face. "We're going," he said, and I didn't argue. Simone was already gathering our stuff from outside, moving fast, throwing camping chairs and the grill into the back without bothering to fold or pack anything properly. I stepped out to help, and that's when I noticed the ground around the van. There were footprints everywhere, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all in a circle around where we'd parked. But they weren't normal footprints. They were too small, like child-sized, but pressed deep into the ground like whatever made them weighed far more than a child should. And they all faced inward, toward the van, like a crowd had gathered around us while we slept and just stood there watching. My stomach turned, and I had to lean against the van to keep from getting sick. Derek saw them too. He grabbed the last of our gear and practically threw it in the back. "Now," he said, "we're leaving now." We climbed into the van and Derek threw it in reverse. But before we could move, Simone screamed and pointed toward the cliff edge. There were people standing there, 5 or 6 of them, lined up along the drop-off with their backs to us, facing the ocean. They were completely still, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing, and even from a distance I could tell something was wrong with their proportions. Their arms hung too low, almost to their knees, and their heads sat on their shoulders at angles that didn't match how human necks work. Derek gunned the engine, spinning the wheel to point us back toward the access road. As we started moving, all the figures at the cliff edge turned around in perfect unison. I got one glimpse of their faces, or where their faces should have been, before Derek accelerated hard and we bounced onto the dirt track leading back to the main road. Where their faces should have been, there was just smooth skin, no features at all, like someone had erased their eyes and nose and mouth, but left the general shape of a head. We drove in terrified silence, branches scraping the sides of the van, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see those things chasing us. But the forest behind us stayed empty, and within 10 minutes we were back on pavement, back in the world of normal things. We didn't stop driving until we hit the border back into Maine. We found a motel outside Calais and paid for 2 rooms, even though it was barely 8 in the morning. The clerk gave us a weird look, but took our money without questions. Derek and Simone shared one room, while I took the other, all of us needing space to process what had happened. I stood in the shower for almost an hour, scrubbing my skin until it was raw, trying to wash off the feeling of being watched by those faceless things. When I finally came out, there were 3 missed calls from Derek and a text that just said, "We need to talk." I threw on clothes and went to their room. They were both sitting on one of the beds, staring at Derek's laptop. Simone's face was ashen. "Show her," she said to Derek, and he turned the screen toward me. He'd been Googling the area where we'd camped, looking for information about Hopewell Cape and the coastal access roads. What he found was a news article from 1989, 35 years ago. Family of 5 vanishes from coastal campsite, the headline read. A family had been camping in almost the exact same spot we'd parked, and one morning their van was found abandoned. No signs of struggle, all their belongings still inside, but the family was gone. The article mentioned that local authorities had found unusual footprints around the site, but provided no other details. The family was never found. Derek scrolled down to show me more articles. That same campsite had been the location of at least 6 disappearances over the past 50 years. Different years, different people, sometimes couples, sometimes solo campers, once a group of 4 college students. All vanished without a trace, all during foggy nights. The most recent disappearance was 8 years ago, a pair of tourists from Germany who'd ignored local warnings about the area. Their rental car was found with the engine running, doors locked from the inside somehow, but no sign of the couple. Why didn't the waitress just tell us not to go there? Simone demanded, voice shaking with anger. Why be cryptic about it? I didn't have an answer. Maybe the locals had learned that directly warning people just made them more curious. Maybe they tried being explicit before and it hadn't worked. Or maybe, and this was the thought that made my skin crawl, maybe something in that place made it impossible to speak directly about what happened there. Like the words wouldn't form right if you tried to tell the truth. We spent the rest of the day in that motel, reading everything we could find about the area. Derek found forum posts from Vanlifers warning each other away from certain spots along the Bay of Fundy. Vague warnings about bad vibes and don't camp there, trust me, but nothing concrete. No one who'd actually encountered what we had and lived to describe it in detail. By evening, we convinced ourselves we were safe. We'd escaped. We were back in the United States, miles away from whatever haunted that clifftop clearing. We got dinner at a diner down the street. Nothing fancy, just burgers and fries, but it was the first food that had tasted like anything since we'd left that campsite. Simone even laughed at one of Derek's terrible jokes. We were going to be okay. We'd chalk it up to a nightmare experience, a story we'd tell someday, when enough time had passed to make it feel unreal. We'd go back to Portland tomorrow, back to our normal lives. That was the plan. We got back to the motel around 9 o'clock, and that's when I noticed the fog. It was rolling into the parking lot in thick streams, that same wrong fog from the campsite. "No," I said out loud. No, that's not possible. Fog is just fog. It can't follow people, it can't travel hundreds of miles to track someone down. But this fog looked identical. That same faint inner glow, that same purposeful movement. Derek saw it too. He grabbed both our arms and pulled us toward our rooms. Pack everything. We're leaving. Right now. I threw my stuff into my bag without bothering to fold anything, hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it closed. Through the motel window, I could see the fog getting thicker, obscuring the parking lot, the road, everything beyond. And in the fog, shapes were moving. Human-shaped but wrong. Moving with that same synchronized precision we'd seen at the cliff edge. Derek pounded on my door. Car. Now. We ran for the van, and I don't think I've ever been more terrified than in those 30 seconds crossing the parking lot. The fog was everywhere. The shapes were getting closer. I could hear that backward speaking again, multiple voices chanting nonsense in perfect unison. Derek got the van started. Thank God it worked this time, and we peeled out of the parking lot so fast we left rubber on the asphalt. I looked back through the rear window and saw at least a dozen figures standing in a line where we'd been parked moments before. Faceless, motionless, watching us go. Derek drove south on Route 1, pushing the van well over the speed limit, and none of us complained. We needed distance. We needed to get as far from that fog and those things as possible. But 20 minutes later, we hit another bank of fog. It appeared suddenly, spreading across the road like a wall, and Derek had to slam on the brakes to avoid driving blind into it. He tried to reverse, but fog was behind us too. We were boxed in again, trapped on a stretch of empty highway with forest on both sides and fog closing in from front and back. And in that fog, shapes were emerging, walking toward us with slow, inevitable steps. We were being hunted by something that didn't care about distance or borders or the normal rules of how reality worked. And I realized with horrible certainty that we'd never actually escaped that campsite at all. Derek threw the van into four-wheel drive and went off-road, crashing through the brush at the side of the highway. Branches shattered against the windshield, and Simone screamed as we bounced over roots and rocks. I braced myself against the ceiling, trying not to get thrown around the back of the van. There, Derek shouted, pointing to a dirt logging road barely visible through the trees. He yanked the wheel hard, and we fishtailed onto the path, the van suspension screaming in protest. Behind us, I could see the fog pouring into the forest like a living thing, flowing between the trees, bringing those faceless shapes with it. The logging road twisted deeper into the woods, narrowing until branches scraped both sides of the van constantly. My marine biology background was completely useless here. I knew ocean ecosystems, tidal patterns, nothing about surviving whatever the hell was hunting us. Derek's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Simone had stopped screaming and gone eerily quiet, just staring out the window at the forest rushing past. The road went on for miles, getting progressively worse, until finally it just ended at a chain-link fence within no trespassing, property of Maritime Lumber CO, signs posted every few feet. Derek slammed on the brakes, and we sat there idling, trying to figure out what to do next. The fence stretched in both directions farther than we could see. Behind us, the fog was still coming, moving through the forest like a slow-motion flood. I could see shapes in it, dozens of them now, walking in formation. The fence, Simone said suddenly, pointing. There was a gate about 50 yards to our left, secured with a chain and padlock. Derek floored it, drove right up to the gate, and we all jumped out. The padlock was rusted but solid. I looked around desperately for something to break it with and found a tire iron in the van's emergency kit. It took 6 hits before the lock finally broke. My arms were shaking with adrenaline and fear. Derek pushed the gate open and drove through, and we barely got it closed again before the first of those things emerged from the fog 30 feet away. Up close, in better light than we'd had at the campsite, I could see them more clearly. They looked human-shaped under old, rotted clothing, but their skin was the wrong color, a grayish blue like drowned corpses. And those smooth, featureless faces turned toward us in perfect unison as we scrambled back into the van. Derek hit the gas, and we sped down what looked like a disused service road deeper into the lumber company property. They can't get through the fence, Simone said hopefully, but I'd seen how the fog moved, how it ignored normal barriers like they didn't exist. Sure enough, within minutes, I could see mist seeping through the chain link behind us, and those shapes were passing right through it like it wasn't there. They're not physical, I said, my scientist brain finally catching up with what I was seeing. Are not entirely physical. Fog doesn't chase people, but if something is using the fog as a medium, projecting itself through it, Derek cut me off. I don't care what they are, Mom. I just want to get away from them. The service road led us to an old lumber mill that looked like it hadn't been operational in decades. Massive industrial buildings with broken windows, rusted equipment scattered around, piles of rotted logs that had probably been sitting there for 20 years. Derek parked the van inside one of the larger buildings, and we killed the engine, sitting in darkness and silence. Through the gaps in the walls, I could see fog beginning to fill the compound outside. It moved methodically, searching each building like it knew we were here somewhere, and was just being patient about finding us. We sat there for hours, watching the fog get closer. Every time it reached a new building, we'd hear sounds from inside, footsteps, things being knocked over, that backwards speaking echoing through empty spaces. Derek tried his phone, but we had no signal this deep in the forest. Simone found an old office area at the back of the mill and discovered a landline phone on a desk. She picked it up. Amazingly, there was a dial tone. She called 911, and I could hear her trying to explain to the dispatcher where we were and what was happening. There are people surrounding the building, she said, which was technically true even if it wasn't the whole truth. They won't let us leave. We need help. Please send someone. The dispatcher kept her on the line, asking questions, promising that police were being dispatched. But he knew cops wouldn't help us. What were they going to arrest? Fog. I watched through a broken window as the shapes moved through the compound, and I noticed something. They never moved through direct light. The few functional lights still running in the compound, emergency lights on poles, amber lights that must have been solar-powered, created pools of illumination that the fog avoided, flowing around them like water around stones. Light, I said. They avoid light. Derek, do we have any flares? Flashlights? Anything bright? We scrambled through the van's emergency supplies and found 2 road flares, 3 flashlights, and a camping lantern. Not much, but maybe enough. Derek also had a portable spotlight he used for roadside repairs. We set them up around the van, creating a perimeter of light. The fog reached the edge of our lit area and stopped, pulling back slightly. The shapes stood just beyond our lights, and I counted at least 30 of them now, arranged in a circle around us. Waiting. They had infinite patience. But our batteries wouldn't last forever, and eventually dawn would come. I hoped. I prayed that morning would drive them away. But deep down, I knew we'd broken some rule by surviving the campsite, by escaping when we should have disappeared like all the others. And whatever controlled these things wasn't going to let us go just because the sun came up. The police never came. Hours passed, and no sirens, no flashlights, nothing. Simone called 911 again and got a busy signal. Derek tried calling, but got the same thing, like the whole emergency system had just stopped working for us. Our phone batteries were dying anyway. The signal kept cutting in and out, and eventually we gave up. We had bigger problems. The camping lantern's battery indicator was showing red. We had maybe an hour before it died, and the flashlights weren't far behind. The road flares had already burned out. Derek's spotlight was our last strong source, running off the van's battery, but I could see the voltage gauge dropping steadily. Around 3 in the morning, the fog started doing something new. It began to pulse, contracting and expanding like lungs breathing, and with each pulse it crept a few inches closer to our light perimeter. The shapes moved with it, maintaining their circle around us, and I realized they were tightening the noose slowly, testing our defenses, looking for weakness. Simone was curled up in the back of the van, alternating between crying and this eerie calm that worried me more than the tears. Derek sat in the driver's seat, one hand on the spotlight control, the other gripping a tire iron like he could fight off fog with blunt force. I watched one of the shapes more closely than the others, try to understand what we were dealing with. It stood directly in front of the van, maybe 15 feet away at the edge of our light. As I stared at it, I started to see details that shouldn't have been there. Under the smooth, featureless face, something was moving. Ripples across the surface like there was liquid underneath the skin, or like the skin itself wasn't solid. And its body didn't quite line up right. The torso was too long, the limbs attached at wrong angles, and it swayed slightly even though there was no wind. It wasn't a dead person or a ghost. It was something wearing the approximate shape of human as a disguise and not doing a very good job of it. "Mom," Derek said quietly, the spotlight's dying. I looked at the gauge. It was in the red now. Minutes maybe. When it went out, the fog would rush in. Those things would be on us, and we'd disappear like everyone else who'd been unlucky enough to camp on that clifftop. I thought about my research, my work with marine ecosystems, decades of studying how organisms adapted to extreme environments. I thought about my children, how Derek had wanted me to live a little, and how that impulse had led us here. I thought about never seeing another sunrise, never finishing my research, becoming nothing but a mystery in a news article that would warn nobody. The spotlight flickered, dimmed. The fog surged forward, and the shapes took a step closer. I could hear them now, not speaking but making sounds, wet clicking noises like tongues moving in mouths that didn't work right. Derek grabbed my hand. Simone moved to the front and grabbed my other hand. We sat there together, family, waiting for the end. And then the spotlight went out. Darkness crashed over us. The fog poured through the spaces where light had been, and I felt temperature drop 30 degrees in seconds. Those wet clicking sounds were everywhere surrounding us, and I could feel air move as if things were moving very close to us, just inches away, examining us in the dark. Something touched my face, fingers too cold and too many of them, tracing across my cheek like reading Braille. I tried to scream, but my throat locked up. The fingers moved to my neck, my collarbone, pressing gently like a doctor checking for broken bones. More hands touched Derek, Simone. I could hear them gasping, trying to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. The fog was inside the van now, thick enough to see even in complete darkness because of that faint glow ahead. And in the fog, I saw faces. Not the faceless things, but real human faces, dozens of them, appearing and disappearing in the mist. Faces twisted in expressions of absolute terror, mouths open in silent screams. They disappeared. All the people who'd vanished from that campsite over the years, trapped somehow in this fog, in whatever these things were. I recognized one face, a young woman with blonde hair that I'd seen in one of the news articles Derek had pulled up. She disappeared in 2016. Her face emerged from the fog right in front of mine, and her mouth moved, trying to form words. No sound came out, but I could read her lips. Join us. Join us. Join us. Over and over. The hands touching me started to pull, not hard but insistent, trying to drag me somewhere. I grabbed onto the van's seat frame, holding tight, but my grip was weakening. The cold was getting into my bones, making my muscles sluggish. I could feel myself starting to let go, to give in, to just accept that this was how things ended. Then Derek started the van. I don't know how he managed it with those things all over him, but he got the key turned, got the engine running, and the headlights blazed alive. The fog recoiled like it had been burned, shrieking, actual shrieking now, dozens of voices screaming in rage or pain. The shapes scattered, pulling back to the edge of the headlight beams. Derek threw the van into drive and punched it, aiming straight for the mill's large loading door. We crashed through the rotted wood and out into the compound, headlights cutting through the fog. He didn't slow down, just drove straight for where he remembered the fence being, and we hit it going 40 miles an hour. The chain link exploded outward, and we bounced on a rough forest floor, branches beating against every surface. Derek kept driving blind through trees, kept the headlights on high beam, kept the engine roaring. We burst on a pavement, I don't know what road, didn't care, and Derek turned toward what he hoped was south, toward civilization, toward light and people and safety. The fog tried to follow. I could see in the mirrors. but couldn't keep up with the van's speed. Within minutes, we'd left it behind. We drove for 2 hours straight, putting as much distance as possible between us and whatever had almost taken us. When we finally stopped, it was at a 24-hour gas station outside Bangor, fluorescent lights blazing in the pre-dawn darkness. We sat in the parking lot, engine running, none of us willing to turn it off. None of us willing to risk the dark again. Derek's hands were shaking so badly, he couldn't hold his coffee cup. Simone had stopped talking entirely. I had red marks on my skin where those fingers had touched me, marks that looked almost like frostbite. We never went back to Portland. We couldn't. What if the fog found us there? What if it was still looking? Derek sold the van 3 days later to a dealership in Boston. Wouldn't even keep it long enough to remove his belongings. Simone quit her teaching job and moved to Arizona, as far from ocean fog as she could get. I resigned from the Institute and moved inland to a small town in Vermont where fog is rare and I can see for miles in every direction. We don't talk about what happened. We don't see each other anymore. The shared trauma made family connections impossible. But sometimes on very foggy mornings, I look out my window and I see shapes standing in my yard, faceless and still, waiting. They never come closer. Not yet, but I know they're patient. I know they remember us. And I know that someday, maybe years from now, maybe tomorrow, the fog will get thick enough that light won't stop them anymore. And when it does, I'll join all those other faces I saw trapped in the mist, screaming silently forever, adding my own voice to the chorus of the disappeared. I keep every light in my house on at night. All of them. The electric bill is insane, but it's worth it. Because the moment the lights go out, I know they'll be there, waiting, ready to finish what they started on that cliff top in New Brunswick. Ready to add 3 more names to the long list of people who ignored warnings and went looking for adventure in places they shouldn't have. We escaped once, but you don't really escape from things like that. You just delay the inevitable. My name is Rochelle Bundy. I'm 37 years old, and I've been living in Tucson, Arizona for the last 5 years working as a freelance web developer. My boyfriend Travis, he's 44, owns a small construction business. Surprised me last month with a vintage 1987 Volkswagen Westphalia that he'd been restoring in secret. Baby blue paint, pop-top roof, the whole classic setup. He'd been talking about doing a road trip through Mexico for years. Said we should experience real adventure before we got too old and comfortable. My best friend Kendra, she's 35 and works as a paramedic, took 2 weeks off to join us because she's always been the type who can't resist a good story to tell later. We plan to drive down through Sonora, hit some beaches, eat amazing food, and camp in spots that weren't overrun with tourists. We crossed into Mexico at Nogales on a Saturday morning. All our paperwork in order, van packed with camping supplies, and enough food to last a week if we needed it. Travis had mapped out this route that would take us along the coast, avoiding the major highways, sticking to smaller roads where we could find hidden beaches and quiet villages. Kendra sat in the back with her medical bag. She never traveled without it, said you never knew when someone might need help, reading a thriller novel and occasionally pointing out interesting landscape features. The drive through Sonora was beautiful in that harsh, desert kind of way, all cacti and red rock formations that looked like they'd been sculpted by aliens. About 4 hours south of the border, Travis turned off onto a coastal road that wasn't even on our GPS. He found on some overlanding forum people posting about incredible beach camping spots that locals knew about but tourists rarely found. The road was rough, barely 2 lanes, winding through scrubland that gradually gave way to salt marshes as we got closer to the Sea of Cortez. We passed through a tiny village, maybe 20 buildings total, a church, a tienda with faded Coca-Cola signs, and an old man sitting outside waved at us. Travis waved back, all friendly tourist energy, but I noticed the old man's smile didn't reach his eyes. He watched us drive past with this expression I couldn't quite read. Not hostile, but not welcoming either. More like resignation or pity. The beach Travis had found was perfect on the surface. A crescent of white sand tucked between rocky outcroppings, calm turquoise water, absolutely nobody else around. We parked the Westphalia about 50 feet from the waterline, and Kendra immediately stripped down to her bathing suit and ran into the waves. Travis set up our awning and camp chairs while I walked the beach looking for shells. The sand was littered with them, beautiful specimens I normally collect, but something made me hesitate. They were all broken, every single one cracked or shattered like something had systematically destroyed them. And there were dead fish scattered along the tide line. Not fresh, but not fully decomposed either, just lying there with their eyes gone and strange marks on their bodies. I mentioned it to Travis, but he brushed it off, said fish died all the time and birds probably got the eyes. Made sense, I guess, except I didn't see any birds. The sky was completely empty, not even gulls, which was weird for a beach. Kendra came back from her swim, saying the water felt strange, too warm in some spots and ice cold in others, temperature fluctuating randomly. She'd also seen something large moving in the deeper water, maybe a shark or dolphin, but it moved wrong, she said. Too smooth, too fast, changing directions in ways that didn't match how fish swim. We laughed about it nervously, made jokes about sea monsters, but none of us suggested swimming again. We spent the afternoon relaxing, drinking beer, playing cards under the awning. As the sun started setting, the temperature dropped fast, and Travis built a fire using driftwood from the beach. The wood burned with weird colors, greens and blues mixed in with normal orange flames, which Travis said was probably salt or minerals in the wood. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, and they tasted off kind of metallic, but we were hungry enough not to care. Kendra told stories from her paramedic work, the crazy calls she'd responded to, and we laughed until our sides hurt. For a few hours, everything felt normal and good, exactly the kind of trip we'd hoped for. Around 9 o'clock, Travis noticed lights out on the water. Dozens of them, small and green, bobbing on the surface maybe a quarter-mile offshore. Fishing boats, he said, but I didn't think so. The lights didn't move like boats. They stayed perfectly still, arranged in what looked like a grid pattern. And they were too close together, maybe 10 feet apart, forming a line that stretched along the coast as far as we could see in both directions. Kendra grabbed the binoculars from the van and tried to get a better look, but the lights were too far away and too dim to make out details. Maybe it's some kind of phenomenon, she suggested, like bioluminescence or something. I'm not a marine biologist, but I'd seen bioluminescence before, and this wasn't it. These lights were steady, unblinking, and they seemed to be watching us. After about 20 minutes, they all went out simultaneously like someone had flipped a switch. The ocean went completely dark, and the sound of waves seemed to get louder in the sudden absence of light. We decided to call a night and retreated into the van, locking the doors even though we were on a deserted beach in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes your instincts tell you to take precautions even when you can't explain why, and all three of us were feeling that prickle of unease that meant something wasn't right here. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of scratching on the van's exterior. Soft, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across metal. Travis was already awake. I could tell by his breathing, but he wasn't moving. The scratching continued, moving along the passenger side, then to the back, then around to the driver's side in a slow circuit. Kendra stirred in the pop-top bed above us and whispered, "What is that?" None of us had an answer. The scratching made another complete circle around the van, then stopped at the rear door. We heard the handle being tested, a gentle rattle as something tried to open it from outside. Thank God Travis had locked everything. The handle rattled again, more insistently this time, and then we heard a voice. A child's voice, speaking Spanish, saying "Por favor, ayúdame. Tengo frío. Please help me, I'm cold." My first instinct was to open the door. Some kid was outside in the middle of the night asking for help. But Travis grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. "No," he whispered. "Something's not right." The child's voice continued, pleading now, saying she was lost, saying her parents had left her, saying she was scared. It was heartbreaking. Kendra started to move toward the door, her paramedic instincts kicking in, but I blocked her way. That voice was too perfect, too practiced, hitting every emotional note designed to make us respond. "Where are your parents?" Travis called out through the closed door. Silence. Then the voice again, Same exact words as before. Por favor, ayúdame. Tengo frío. Word for word identical, same inflection, like a recording being played. Travis asked another question in his broken Spanish, asking the child's name, where she lived. Same response. Por favor, ayúdame. Tengo frío. It was a loop, a trick, something using a child's voice to lure us outside. We sat frozen, listening to that pleading voice repeat itself over and over, maybe 15 times before it finally stopped. Footsteps moved away from the van, small footsteps crunching on sand, fading toward the water. None of us could sleep after that. We sat up, lights on inside the van, whispering about what it could have been. Maybe a disturbed kid from the village, Kendra suggested, but that didn't explain the looping speech. Maybe a recording, Travis offered, someone playing a prank, but who would do that and why? I didn't have theories, just knew that I wanted to leave as soon as it was light enough to drive safely. We sat there watching the windows, and around 3:30, we saw figures on the beach. At least a dozen of them, standing in a line between our van and the water. Human-shaped but wrong, standing too still, facing us but with their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Travis aimed our flashlight out the window, and in the beam, we could see them more clearly. They looked like people who'd been in the water too long, skin bloated and pale, clothes rotted and hanging in strips, hair matted with seaweed and sand. But they were standing upright, not collapsed like bodies should be, and their eyes reflected the flashlight like animal eyes, throwing back green light. "What the fuck?" Travis breathed, and that about summed it up. These things, whatever they were, stood there for maybe 10 minutes while we watched in horror. Then, moving together like a choreographed dance, they all turned and walked into the ocean. They didn't swim, just walked, going deeper until the water closed over their heads, and they disappeared. "We're leaving," I said, and nobody argued. Travis climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and nothing happened. The van was completely dead. No dash lights, no engine turnover, nothing. He tried again with the same result. "Battery was fine yesterday," he muttered, popping the hood. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside before I could stop him, and I held my breath while he checked the engine. Through the windshield, I could see him moving around the front of the van, and then he stopped, flashlight pointing at something on the ground. "Rochelle, Kendra, you need to see this," he called, voice tight. We climbed out reluctantly, and Travis showed us what he'd found. There were footprints in the sand all around the van, small ones, child-sized, and larger ones that looked human but had too many toes. They covered the entire area around our campsite, hundreds of them, all leading to and from the water. And there was something else, a circle of stones arranged around the van, smooth beach stones placed deliberately in a perfect ring about 20 feet in diameter. In the center of each stone, someone had carved a symbol, crude but intentional marks that looked vaguely like eyes or spirals. "Some kind of ritual thing," Kendra said, and I could hear the fear in her voice despite her attempts to sound clinical and rational. Travis checked the battery connections and found them corroded overnight, covered in white crystalline growth that shouldn't have been possible in just a few hours. He tried to clean them with his shirt, but the corrosion was too severe. We were stuck here, on this beach, with whatever those things in the water were. The sun would be up in a couple hours, I told myself. Whatever was happening seemed to be nocturnal. We just had to survive until dawn, and then we'd walk to that village we'd passed, get help, get the van fixed, and get the hell out of here. Simple plan. Except when I looked toward where the village should be, the direction we'd driven from, there was just empty beach stretching into darkness. The road we'd come in on had disappeared, or we'd somehow gotten turned around, or the landscape had changed. Nothing made sense anymore, and the sky to the east showed no sign of lightning, even though dawn should have been close. We were trapped, lost, surrounded by things that came from the ocean and arranged stones in circles and used children's voices to hunt. And I had the horrible feeling that we weren't the first people to camp on this beach and wake up to find themselves in a nightmare they couldn't escape. We stayed close to the van as the hours crawled past, watching the ocean for movement. The water was perfectly calm, no waves at all, which was wrong for a coast that should have had tidal action. It sat there like glass, reflecting nothing because the sky had gone dark, even though my watch said it was almost 6 in the morning. Time was passing, but dawn wasn't coming, and that violated every natural law I understood. Kendra kept checking her medical bag. Organizing and reorganizing supplies like busy work could keep the panic at bay. Travis dismantled half the van's engine, trying to fix whatever had killed it, but the corrosion had spread to internal components, eating through wiring and metal like aggressive cancer. Around what my watch claimed was 7 a.m., we heard singing coming from the water. Not the child's voice from before. This was multiple voices, adult voices, singing in Spanish. A hymn, I thought, or maybe a folk song, something old and beautiful and completely out of place. The voices got closer, and shapes emerged from the ocean. People wading out of the water, maybe 20 of them, dressed in church clothes like they were attending Sunday Mass. They walked up the beach in 2 neat lines, still singing, and I recognized the old man from the village among them. His clothes were soaking wet, seawater running off him in streams, but he smiled like everything was normal. The villagers arranged themselves in a semicircle around our campsite, just outside the ring of marked stones. They kept singing, all looking at us with expressions that might have been friendly or might have been something else entirely. When the song ended, the old man stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented English. "You should not have come here. This beach is not for visitors. Not for many years now." Travis asked what he meant, why they hadn't warned us properly back in the village. The old man sighed, water dripping from his clothes onto the sand. "We warn everyone. You heard what you wanted to hear. Everyone does." Kendra asked what was happening, why we couldn't leave, what those things in the water were. The old man looked sad, genuinely sad, and said, "The ocean is hungry here. Has been since the ship came 40 years ago. Cargo ship carrying chemicals. Ran aground on the rocks during a storm. Everything spilled into the water. Killed all the fish, poisoned the beach. But something in those chemicals, it didn't just kill. It changed things. Made the water alive in a new way. Made it hungry." He gestured to the calm ocean behind him. "It takes people now. Takes them and brings them back wrong. We feed it tourists sometimes, people who don't listen to warnings, so it leaves our village alone. A bargain, yes? Not good, but necessary." I felt sick. These people had deliberately sent us here, knowing what would happen. Travis was furious, demanding they help us leave, threatening to report them to authorities. The old man just smiled that sad smile and said, "There are no authorities here anymore. The ocean ate them too when they came investigating. You cannot fight it. You can only feed it or become part of it." The other villagers started singing again, a different song this time, something that sounded like a lullaby, and the ocean began to move. The water rose without waves, lifting straight up like it was being poured into an invisible container. It formed a wall, maybe 15 feet high, stretching along the entire beach, and in that wall I could see shapes moving. Bodies, dozens of them, suspended in the water like specimens in formaldehyde. Some looked fresh, some were just bones, some were in that horrible in-between state of decomposition. And they were all moving, mouths opening and closing, hands reaching toward us. The wall of water began to advance up the beach, moving slowly but inevitably toward our campsite. We ran. There was nowhere to go, but we ran anyway, away from the ocean and the advancing water and the singing villagers who'd fed us to this thing. We made it maybe 50 yards before the sand beneath our feet turned to mud, then to thick sludge that grabbed at our shoes. Kendra went down first, sinking to her knees in seconds. Travis and I tried to pull her out, but the more we struggled, the faster we sank. It was like quicksand, but wet, and it stank of rotting chemicals. Behind us, the water wall was getting closer, and I could hear those bodies in it moaning, making sounds that shouldn't come from dead throats. Travis managed to pull Kendra free, and we scrambled sideways, trying to find solid ground. The beach had become a trap, soft and yielding everywhere we stepped. We circled back toward the van, the only solid landmark we could see, and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. The villagers had stopped singing and were walking back into the ocean, their job done, leaving us to whatever came next. The water wall loomed over us now, blocking out what little light filtered through the perpetual darkness. I could see individual faces in the water. Men, women, children, all staring at us with eyes that were either empty sockets or glowing with that same green light we'd seen the night before. The wall of water crashed down. I remember the cold, the overwhelming pressure being tumbled and spun like clothes in a washing machine. I remember hands grabbing me, dozens of hands, all wrong, too soft or too hard, pulling me in different directions. I remember screaming and getting a mouth full of salt water and chemicals that burned my throat. I remember seeing Travis being dragged deeper, his face a mask of terror, and Kendra fighting against the current with the strength of someone who wasn't ready to die. Then everything went dark, and I felt myself sinking, the pressure in my ears building until I thought my head would implode. This was it. This was how we died. Drowned on a beach that shouldn't exist, by an ocean that had become something alive and malevolent, fed to it by villagers who'd made a devil's bargain to save themselves. My last thought before the water filled my lungs was that my parents would never know what happened to us, would never get closure, would just have 3 more names on a missing persons list that would never be solved. I woke up coughing water, my lungs burning like I'd inhaled fire. Sent under my hands, rough and real. I was on the beach again, lying just above the tide line, and my first coherent thought was that I'd somehow survived. I rolled onto my side and vomited seawater mixed with something oily and dark. My whole body ached like I'd been beaten with hammers. When I could finally lift my head, I saw Travis and Kendra a few feet away, both conscious, both looking as wrecked as I felt. "What happened?" Kendra croaked, her voice barely recognizable. None of us knew. The ocean had taken us, should have killed us, but here we were on the same beach in daylight. Real daylight this time. The sun was up, the sky was blue, and the water looked normal, gentle waves rolling in like any ordinary day. The Westphalia was still there, but it looked different. Older somehow. The paint faded more than it should be, rust on the chrome, one tire completely flat. Travis staggered over to it and tried the door. Locked, and none of us had the keys. They were probably at the bottom of the ocean. He smashed the driver's window with a rock, reached in to pop the lock, and we all climbed inside to assess the damage. Everything we'd left in the van was there, but wrong. Our clothes were moldy, our food supplies rotted, the upholstery covered in a thin layer of slime. My phone was in the cup holder where I'd left it, but when I tried to turn it on, the battery was dead and corrosion had eaten through the charging port. "How long were we in the water?" Kendra asked, voicing what we were all thinking. It had felt like minutes, maybe an hour at most, but the condition of the van suggested much longer. Travis found a newspaper stuffed under the seat. He bought it at the border crossing for entertainment. The date was from when we'd started our trip, but his watch, still working despite being waterlogged, showed a date 3 weeks later. "No way," he said. "No fucking way we've been here for 3 weeks." But the evidence was all around us. The van had deteriorated like it had been sitting abandoned for weeks. Our bodies felt normal, not dehydrated or starved like we should be after 3 weeks, but time had clearly passed in ways we couldn't account for. We needed to leave immediately. That much was clear. The van obviously wasn't going anywhere, so we'd have to walk. Travis smashed the rest of the windows out with methodical rage, venting his fear and frustration on the vehicle that had brought us here. Kendra salvaged what she could from her medical bag. Most of it was ruined, but she found some bandages and antibiotic ointment still sealed in plastic. I grabbed a water bottle that looked clean, shook it, heard liquid sloshing inside. We had basically nothing, but staying here wasn't an option. We started walking in what we hoped was the direction of the village, following the beach north. The landscape looked wrong in daylight. The beach stretched farther than it should, curving away into the distance with no end in sight. The scrubland beyond the sand was dead, every plant brown and brittle, every tree leafless like it was deep winter, even though the heat was oppressive. We walked for hours, and the scenery didn't change. Same beach, same dead vegetation, same absence of any wildlife or signs of human presence. No birds, no insects, no sounds except our footsteps and labored breathing. It was like walking through a photograph, a frozen moment that repeated endlessly. Around noon, We found the first body. It was half buried in sand, one arm sticking up at an angle, bones picked clean by something. Travis wanted to keep moving, but Kendra insisted on checking it. Professional instinct or morbid curiosity, I wasn't sure. She dug around it carefully and uncovered a skeleton wearing rotted camping clothes and a backpack that had somehow survived. Inside the pack was a wallet with an ID, Canadian passport, photo of a young man who'd probably been in his 20s. Date of issue was from 15 years ago. Jesus, Kendra whispered. How many people has this place taken? We found 3 more bodies over the next few hours of walking, all in various states of decomposition, all with camping gear or signs that they'd been tourists passing through. One had a journal in a Ziploc bag, pages filled with handwriting that devolved from neat notes about their trip to frantic scrawls about being trapped, about the water coming alive, about villagers who wouldn't help. The final entry, barely legible. It's been 6 months. No one is coming. The ocean talks to me now. I think I'll join it soon. Better than starving. 6 months. That person had survived here for 6 months before giving up or being taken. As the sun started to set, and thank God it actually set, proving that time was moving normally again. We still hadn't reached the village or found any road or seen any other living person. We were completely lost on a beach that seemed to go on forever, with nothing but dead plants and older victims for company. We should stop, Kendra said. Find shelter before dark. I don't want to be walking when those things come back. None of us wanted a repeat of the previous night, so we looked for anywhere that might offer protection. The only option was a rock formation about a quarter-mile inland, huge boulders piled together creating small caves and overhangs. We climbed into the largest cave we could find, barely big enough for all 3 of us to squeeze in. It stank of animal. Something had used this as a den, though what kind of animal could survive in this dead landscape, I didn't know. We had no fire, no food, no light. We huddled together as darkness fell, and I've never felt more hopeless in my life. We'd survived drowning only to be stuck in some impossible loop of coastline where time worked wrong and people came to die slowly. Travis was crying quietly, and Kendra held him, and I stared out at the darkening ocean, wondering if we should just walk into it and get it over with. At least drowning would be faster than whatever slow death awaited us here. But I'm not a quitter, never have been, so I made myself believe we'd find a way out tomorrow. We just had to survive one more night. I didn't sleep at all, kept watch while Travis and Kendra managed to doze fitfully, their exhaustion overriding their fear. Around midnight, I heard movement outside our cave, footsteps in sand, multiple sets approaching from the direction of the water. My whole body went rigid. The footsteps stopped just outside the cave entrance, and I could see silhouettes blocking the starlight. Those things from the water come to finish what they'd started. I held my breath, praying they couldn't see us tucked back in the darkness. For several minutes, nothing happened. They just stood there, swaying slightly, and I could hear that wet clicking sound they made, like tongues against teeth that didn't fit right in their mouths. Then they started to speak. Not the child's voice from before, but our voices. They mimicked Travis saying, "What the fuck?" the exact tone he'd used when we first saw them on the beach. Then Kendra's voice saying, "We should stop," her word from earlier. Then my voice saying, "Something's not right," something I'd said a dozen times over the past few days. They were replaying our speech back to us, sentence fragments mixing together in nonsensical order, like they were learning language by repetition. It was disturbing beyond words, hearing myself speak from something that wasn't me. They continued this for maybe 20 minutes, our words tumbling out of their throats in endless permutations, before they finally moved away, footsteps fading back toward the water. I woke Travis and Kendra as soon as I was sure those things were gone. "We can't stay on this beach," I said. "Whatever this place is, it's not natural. We need to go inland, find higher ground, get away from the water." Travis pointed out that inland was all dead vegetation and we had no water, no supplies. I argued that staying here meant becoming like those bodies we'd found, slowly dying while the ocean played with us. Kendra, always the practical one, suggested we had maybe 2 days before dehydration became critical. We had to find water, find people, find something, or we'd die regardless. So when dawn broke, we headed inland. The dead scrubland was even worse than the beach. Everything was brittle and sharp, branches catching at our clothes and skin. The ground was hardpan, cracked and dusty, and every step kicked up powder that made us cough. We walked for hours without seeing anything alive, any water, any sign that this landscape had ever supported life. The heat was brutal, had to be over 100 degrees, and we were all showing signs of heat exhaustion. Kendra stumbled and fell, scraping her hands bloody on the sharp ground. I helped her up, and we kept moving because stopping meant dying. Around noon, we found the town. Just appeared out of nowhere as we crested a small rise, a collection of buildings that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. Adobe structures with collapsed roofs, streets overgrown with dead weeds, cars rusted to skeletal frames. We stumbled into what might have been the main street, hoping desperately to find water or shelter or anything useful. The town was completely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing but the sound of our footsteps echoing off empty buildings. Travis found a well in the town square, and we nearly cried with relief, but when we looked down into it, there was no water. Just darkness going down impossibly far, and when Travis dropped a stone into it, we never heard it hit bottom. We split up to search buildings, staying within sight of each other, calling out if we found anything useful. I checked what looked like a general store, shelves bare except for a few empty cans and bottles. There was a calendar on the wall behind the counter, yellowed and faded, stuck on June 1984. 40 years ago, this town had been dead for 40 years. In the back room, I found something that made my blood run cold. A map pinned to the wall showing the Sonoran coast, with red circles marked along the beach. Dozens of them, maybe 50, each circle labeled with dates going back to the 1970s. Different beaches, different years, all along the stretch of coast. And written in Spanish across the top, lugares de alimentation, feeding places. I called Travis and Kendra over, showed them what I'd found. It's not just our beach, I said, hands shaking. This is happening all along the coast. Has been for decades. All these towns, all these beaches, they're all feeding grounds for whatever that thing in the water is. Kendra studied the map, her medical training making her analytical even in crisis. These dates, they cluster around certain times of year. Spring and fall mostly, like it has a cycle, a feeding cycle. Travis found documentation in a drawer, newspaper clippings, and official reports, all in Spanish. Chemical spill 1982, missing tourist 1985, entire village evacuated 1989, investigation discontinued 1991. The Mexican government knew something was wrong with this region and just abandoned it, evacuated people, and stopped looking into what happened here. We're in a dead zone, Travis said quietly. No one comes here anymore except people who don't know better, and we feed that thing until... He trailed off, but we all understood. Until we died or became like those waterlogged things walking out of the ocean. There has to be a way out, Kendra insisted, but she didn't sound convinced. We searched more buildings, finding more evidence of rapid abandonment. Meals left on tables, clothes still hanging in closets, children's toys scattered in yards. Whatever had driven these people away had done it fast, without time to pack or plan. And now we were trapped in the same place that had swallowed entire communities. As sunset approached, we barricaded ourselves in the most intact building we could find. An old church with a heavy door and narrow windows we could cover with boards. We had no food, no water, and we were rapidly weakening. Kendra had started coughing, probably inhaling too much dust and chemical residue from the poison landscape. Travis was developing sores on his exposed skin where the sun had burned through our inadequate protection. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, my thoughts getting fuzzy around the edges. Dehydration and exhaustion were taking their toll. We sat in that church as darkness fell, and we heard them coming, footsteps from every direction, converging on the town. Through the cracks in the boarded windows, we could see figures moving between buildings. Dozens of them now, maybe hundreds, all heading toward the church like they knew exactly where we were hiding. They surrounded the building and started that clicking sound, all in unison, a rhythm that vibrated through the walls and floor. Then our voices again, but different this time. They were forming sentences that made sense, using our speech patterns and vocabulary to communicate. "Come out, Rochelle," my voice said from outside. "Join us, Travis," Travis's voice called. "The water is home, Kendra," Kendra's voice sang. They'd learned enough from us to become us, or pretend to be us, and they wanted us to open the door and surrender. The clicking got louder, more insistent, and the door started to shake as they pushed against it. Our barricade wouldn't hold for long. "I'm sorry," Travis said, taking my hand. "I'm so sorry I brought you here." I told him it wasn't his fault. We'd all agreed to this trip, but the words felt hollow. We were going to die in this abandoned church, surrounded by things that wore our voices, in a dead zone that the world had forgotten. Unless I looked at the altar, still intact, and remembered that these things avoided light. They'd pulled back from our headlights, retreated from our flashlight beams. Fire was light. "Help me," I said, starting to tear up the old wooden pews. Travis understood immediately, began ripping boards free. Kendra found matches in her medical bag. Thank God. And we built a pile of wood in the center of the church. We lit it just as the door burst open and they poured in like a flood. The fire blazed up, bright and hot, and they recoiled, screaming in our voices, a horrible chorus of our own words turned into sounds of pain and rage. The fire gave us maybe minutes, but minutes were something. Travis saw it first. A trapdoor in the floor behind the altar, probably leading to a cellar or crypt. We pried it open as the flames started to die down, jumped into darkness without knowing what was below, pulled the trapdoor shut above us, and fell into the unknown, hoping we'd find salvation instead of just another way to die. We landed in water. Not ocean water, fresh water, cold and clean, flowing through what felt like a natural underground stream. The current grabbed us and pulled us along through complete darkness, and I gave up fighting, just let it carry me wherever it went, because I had no strength left and no options anyway. We tumbled through that underground river for what might have been hours or minutes. I lost all sense of time in the darkness and cold. At some point, I bumped into Travis, then Kendra, and we grabbed onto each other, three people riding a current into the unknown together. The water got faster, the tunnel narrower, and then suddenly we were falling, dropping through air and crashing into a pool that knocked the wind from my lungs. I surfaced, gasping, and saw stars above. Real stars in a real sky. We'd come out somewhere else, somewhere with normal night sky and normal air and the sound of normal wind and normal trees. The pool we'd landed in was fed by a waterfall, and beyond it was jungle. Actual living jungle with green plants and the sounds of insects and night birds. We dragged ourselves onto the shore and collapsed, coughing and shaking but alive. When morning came, we found a road, and then a truck driver who picked us up and drove us to Hermosillo. He asked what had happened to us, why we looked like we'd been through hell. We said our van broke down and we got lost hiking. He accepted that, gave us water and food, asked no questions about why 3 Americans were wandering out of the jungle in the middle of nowhere looking half dead. We made it back across the border 2 days later, and we never spoke about what really happened. Never told anyone about the feeding places, the chemical ocean, the things that learn our voices. We sold the Westphalia for scrap. What was left of it, anyway? The Mexican authorities found it on that beach and towed it to impound. We went back to our separate lives, but we're different now. Broken in ways that don't show on the outside. Travis developed a phobia of water, so severe he can't even shower anymore, just sponge baths. Kendra quit being a paramedic, couldn't handle the responsibility of saving lives after we'd been so helpless to save our own. And me, I moved to Denver, as far from any ocean as I could get. But sometimes I hear my own voice speaking words I'm not saying, echoing from nowhere, and I know they're still out there. Still learning, still feeding, still waiting for the next people who ignore warnings and go looking for adventure in places that want to consume them. The Mexican government knows, has always known, and does nothing because what can you do against an ocean that's become alive and hungry? You just mark the feeding places on maps that nobody sees, evacuate the towns, and hope people are smart enough to stay away. We weren't smart enough. but we were lucky enough to survive. Most people aren't. My name is Franklin Morse. I'm 59 years old, and I've been living in Boise, Idaho for most of my adult life, working as a civil engineer for the state highway department. My nephew Austin, he's 26, just graduated with some useless liberal arts degree, asked if he could borrow my old Chevy conversion van for a solo road trip to find himself, or whatever young people do these days. I told him that was stupid, that if he wanted adventure, he should come with me instead. I just retired, had nothing but time, and figured I could show the kid what real camping was like before he wasted gas driving aimlessly around country. My sister Ellen, she's 54 and teaches kindergarten in Meridian, decided to join us last minute because she didn't trust me not to traumatize her son with my old man lectures, as she called them. The plan was to drive north into Montana, hit some national forests I'd surveyed years ago for highway projects, and spend a week away from civilization. We left Boise on a Thursday morning, my van loaded with proper camping equipment. Not this glamping nonsense you see online, but real gear for real outdoors. Austin spent the first 2 hours glued to his phone until we lost signal somewhere past Salmon, and then he actually started looking out the window and having conversations like a normal human being. Ellen sat in the passenger seat knitting. She always knitted when she was nervous, said it calmed her, and occasionally pointing out wildlife or interesting rock formations. The drive up through Idaho was gorgeous, all mountain passes and dense forests, exactly the kind of landscape I'd spent decades studying for work, but never really appreciated until retirement gave me time to actually look at it. We crossed into Montana around noon and stopped for lunch at a truck stop in Missoula. Austin wanted to know where exactly we were heading, and I pulled out an actual paper map, none of this GPS garbage, and showed him a Forest Service road I'd worked on back in the 90s. Led to a remote area near the Lolo National Forest, beautiful camping spots along a creek, totally isolated. Ellen asked if it was safe, and I told her I'd surveyed that entire region personally, knew every inch of it, nothing to worry about. Looking back, my confidence was the problem. I thought I knew that area, but land changes, and sometimes it changes in ways that maps don't show and engineers don't anticipate. The Forest Service road was in worse shape than I remembered. Potholes, washouts, sections where vegetation had reclaimed the pavement entirely. My van handled it fine, built like a tank, but Austin kept commenting on how rough it was, and couldn't we find somewhere easier to access. I told him adventure required effort, that you couldn't Instagram your way to real wilderness experiences. Ellen defended him half-heartedly while counting stitches in her knitting, staying out of our bickering like she'd done for 26 years of Austin being my nephew. The road climbed higher into the mountains, and the forest got thicker, old growth pines blocking out most of the sunlight, even though it was only mid-afternoon. About 5 miles past where my map showed the road ending, we found a continuation that shouldn't have existed. A newer section, paved recently, but already cracking, leading even deeper into the forest. Did they extend this after you retired? Ellen asked, and I had to admit I didn't know. I'd been retired 3 months, but road projects took years to plan and execute. This section looked hastily built, poorly engineered, the kind of work that wouldn't pass any inspection I'd ever conducted. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the new section to see where it led. Austin was excited, said maybe we discovered some secret government facility or abandoned military base. Kid watched too many conspiracy videos online. The road terminated at a clearing that was definitely not on my map. Large clearing, maybe 2 acres, completely surrounded by dense forest with a small pond at the far end. And there were structures, 3 of them, concrete buildings with no windows, flat roofs, metal doors with heavy locks. They looked like bunkers or storage facilities, all painted in faded green that barely distinguished them from the surrounding vegetation. No signs, no markings, no indication of who built them or why. The whole setup screamed, "Keep out," but in that subtle way that made you more curious rather than less. I parked the van near the pond, and we all got out to investigate. Austin immediately started filming everything on his phone. Of course he did, narrating like he was making a documentary about our mysterious discovery. Ellen was more cautious, staying close to the van, saying maybe we should just camp somewhere else. I walked around the perimeter of the nearest bunker, examining the construction. The concrete was relatively new, maybe 10 years old, but already showing signs of degradation that shouldn't happen that fast. Cracks, staining, sections where the aggregate was exposed. And the metal door had scratches around the lock, deep gouges like something with claws to try to get in. We're out. That thought made me pause, made me reconsider Ellen's suggestion to leave, but I was too proud to admit I might be wrong about this being a good camping spot. We set up camp in the clearing as the sun started to set, pitching a tent for Ellen and Austin while I planned to sleep in a van like I always did. The pond water looked clear enough, and I filled our containers even though Austin complained about it tasting weird. Metallic, he said, with a bitter aftertaste. I told him that's what real water tasted like when it hadn't been filtered through a city treatment plant 17 times. We made a fire using dead wood from the forest edge and cooked a simple dinner of canned stew and bread. As darkness fell completely, I noticed something odd. The forest was absolutely silent. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just oppressive quiet that pressed against your ears like physical weight. Ella noticed too, stopped knitting mid-stitch and looked around nervously. "Where are all the animals?" she asked. I didn't have an answer, and that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. After 40 years studying land and terrain, I knew that unnatural silence meant something was fundamentally wrong with an ecosystem. But we were already set up, the fire was going, and I convinced myself it was just the altitude or the season or something perfectly normal that I was overthinking. First mistake of many that night. We sat around the fire until maybe 9 o'clock. Ellen's still working on her knitting project, a scarf for Austin's birthday next month, while Austin scrolled through photos on his phone and I nursed a flask of whiskey I'd brought along. The silence was getting to all of us, even though nobody wanted to say it out loud. Austin finally broke, asking if we should just pack up and drive back to the main road, find a campground with other people. I was about to agree when we heard the first sound that wasn't us, a low humming coming from the direction of the bunkers. Not mechanical, more organic, like someone was humming a tune with their mouth closed. It rose and fell in pitch, almost musical, and it was coming from inside one of the locked buildings. Ellen stood up fast, her knitting falling to the ground. "Someone's in there," she whispered. Austin grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the nearest bunker. The humming continued, unchanged, not responding to our light or our presence. I walked over to the metal door and pressed my ear against it. The humming was definitely coming from inside, and it sounded close, like whoever was making the noise was standing right on the other side of the door. "Hello," I called out. The humming stopped immediately. Complete silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then scratching, frantic scratching against metal from the inside, like fingernails or claws trying to dig through the door. I backed away fast, my engineer's mind trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe an animal had gotten trapped inside, or squatters were living in the bunkers, and we disturbed them. But the humming had sounded too deliberate, too structured to be animal noise. And the scratching was too aggressive, too desperate. Austin wanted to investigate further, said maybe someone needed help, but Ellen grabbed his arm and pulled him back toward the van. "We're leaving," she said, voice tight with fear. "Right now? I don't care what's in there. We're not staying to find out." I agreed, started breaking down our camp while Austin and Ellen loaded gear into the van. The scratching from the bunker got louder, more insistent, and then we heard it from the second bunker too. Then the third. All three buildings now had something inside them scratching at the doors, and the sound was synchronizing, becoming rhythmic, like they were communicating with each other through percussion. Scratch, 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 pause, scratch, 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 pause. Over and over, building in intensity. I threw the last of our equipment into the van and climbed into the driver's seat. Turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't turn over, wouldn't even crank. "Not again," I muttered, popping the hood. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the engine while Ellen and Austin watched nervously from inside the van. Everything looked normal, battery connections were fine, no obvious damage, no reason the van shouldn't start. I tried the key again from under the hood, listening for any sound from the starter. Dead silence. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The battery cables had been cut. Not frayed or broken, but cleanly severed, the copper wire exposed where something sharp had sliced through the insulation. Someone had sabotaged my van while we were sitting by the fire. I looked around the clearing, suddenly aware that we might not be alone out here, that something had been close enough to tamper with my vehicle without any of us noticing. "What's wrong?" Ellen called from the window. I didn't want to panic them, but there was no point lying. "Battery cables are cut. Someone did this deliberately." Austin's face went pale in the flashlight beam. "There's someone out here with us?" I told him I didn't know, but we needed to stay together and stay alert. The scratching from the bunkers had stopped, which was somehow worse than when it was happening. Now we had silence again, oppressive and total, and somewhere in that darkness was whoever or whatever had disabled our vehicle. We huddled in the van with the doors locked, my flashlight the only source of light since I didn't want to drain the battery trying to use the van's interior lights. Not that the battery was useful anymore with cut cables. Ellen was crying quietly, and Austin was trying to comfort her while clearly terrified himself. I felt like an idiot. I brought my family to this isolated location based on decades-old knowledge and professional pride, and now we were trapped here with no transportation and something hostile in the darkness. My engineering expertise was useless against whatever this was. Around midnight, we heard footsteps circling the van. Slow, measured steps, crunching on gravel and pine needles. I aimed my flashlight out the window, but couldn't see anyone. The footsteps continued their circuit, and I noticed they were perfectly timed, exactly 4 seconds between each step. Too regular to be natural. Austin whispered that maybe it was an animal, but I'd never heard of any animal that walked with such mechanical precision. The footsteps completed several circles around the van, then stopped at the driver's side door. We all froze, barely breathing. A hand pressed against the window. I could see the outline clearly, 5 fingers spread wide. But the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, and when it pressed harder against the glass, I saw there were no fingerprints, just smooth skin. The hand withdrew, and the footsteps moved away toward the bunkers. We heard metal scraping, locks being opened. All 3 bunker doors opening simultaneously with squeals of rusty hinges. Then silence again for maybe a minute before we heard them emerge. Multiple sets of footsteps, at least a dozen, moving around the clearing in that same measured 4-second rhythm. They weren't approaching the van, just moving around it in wider circles, and occasionally we'd catch glimpses of shapes in the darkness at the edge of my flashlight beam. Tall shapes, human-like, but not quite right in their proportions or the way they moved. "What do they want?" Ellen whispered, voice shaking. I had no answer. Whatever these things were, they'd been locked in those bunkers, and now they were free, and we were trapped with them. Austin's phone still had battery, and he tried calling 911, but we had no signal this deep in the forest. I calculated our options. We could stay in the van and hope these things lost interest, or we could make a run for the tree line and try to hike out in the dark. Both options were terrible, both likely to get us killed. But sitting in a disabled van waiting for dawn seemed slightly less suicidal than stumbling through unknown forest in pitch black pursued by things that moved within human precision. So we waited, listening to those footsteps circle endlessly, watching shapes move in the darkness, and praying that whatever was out there would leave us alone until sunrise gave us enough light to see what we were dealing with and maybe find a way to survive. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the trees and revealing the clearing in cold detail. The shapes that had circled us all night were gone. At least, we couldn't see them anymore. The bunker doors stood open, dark rectangles against the faded green concrete, and I could see now that the interiors were empty. Just bare concrete rooms with drain holes in the floors and nothing else. No equipment, no supplies, no indication of what the buildings had been used for. Austin opened the van door carefully, and we stepped out into freezing morning air. The temperature had dropped at least 30 degrees overnight, our breath visible in clouds, frost covering everything despite it being midsummer. I inspected the damage to my van in better light. The battery cables were definitely cut, sliced cleanly through about 2 inches from the battery terminals. I had spare cable in my toolbox, but splicing new connections would take time and concentration, neither of which I had much of after a sleepless night of terror. Ellen suggested we hike out, follow the road back to the main highway, flag down help. It was maybe 20 miles, doable in a day if we moved fast. But Austin pointed to the tree line and said, "Look at the trees." We all turned to look, and my stomach dropped. Every tree at the edge of the clearing had marks carved into the bark, symbols I didn't recognize, geometric patterns and spirals that covered the trunks from ground level to about 8 feet up. They hadn't been there yesterday when we arrived. I would have noticed something that obvious. Someone or something had carved them overnight while we huddled in the van. The patterns repeated every few feet along the entire perimeter of the clearing, hundreds of them, forming a continuous ring around our position. "What does it mean?" Austin asked, filming the symbols with his phone. I told him I didn't know, but it felt like a warning or a boundary marker. We were either being kept in or something else was being kept out. Ellen insisted we leave immediately, start hiking despite the symbols and the cold and the lingering sense that we were being watched. I agreed, started gathering essential supplies, water, food, first aid kit, my maps and compass. That's when we heard the humming again, but this time it was coming from the forest, from multiple directions surrounding us. The same rising and falling pitch we'd heard from the bunkers, but amplified, dozens of voices humming in harmony. The sound made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly. Austin dropped his phone, clutching his head and saying it hurt. The sound was inside his skull. Ellen pressed her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The humming penetrated everything. As quickly as it started, it stopped. In the sudden silence, we heard something new: engines. Multiple vehicles approaching on the Forest Service road. For a moment, I felt relief, thinking maybe rangers had found us, maybe we'd be rescued. But the vehicles that rolled into the clearing weren't ranger trucks. They were black SUVs, 3 of them, with no markings or plates. They parked in a line blocking the road out, and men in black tactical gear emerged carrying rifles. Not police, not military, at least not any military I recognized. Private security or something else entirely. The man in charge approached us, middle-aged with gray hair and cold eyes that assessed us like we were contamination to be cleaned up. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, voice flat and emotionless. I started to explain that we'd just been camping, didn't know the area was restricted, but he cut me off. "This site is classified. You've been exposed to hazardous materials. You'll need to come with us for decontamination and debriefing." Ellen asked what hazardous materials, what was in the bunkers, why weren't there any warning signs? The man ignored her questions completely, gestured to his team, and they surrounded us with weapons not quite pointed at us, but ready to be. "We're not going anywhere until you explain what's happening," I said, trying to sound authoritative, falling back on decades of dealing with bureaucracy and government oversight. The man smiled, and it wasn't friendly. "You don't have a choice, Mr. Morse. You can come voluntarily, or we can make you come. Either way, you're leaving this clearing in one of our vehicles." He knew my name. How did he know my name? We hadn't told them anything, and I didn't see any identification on their gear. Austin started asking questions rapid fire. Who were they? What agency? What authority gave him the right? And one of the tactical team members moved forward and grabbed him by the arm, roughly. That's when Ellen snapped. My sister, who taught 5-year-olds and knitted scarves and avoided confrontation her entire life, pulled away from the men, trying to corral her, and screamed, "We're not criminals. We have rights. You can't just..." The man in charge nodded to his team, and they moved in fast, grabbing all 3 of us. I fought back, managed to break one guy's nose before 3 more piled on and forced me to the ground. Austin was yelling, Ellen was screaming, and through it all I could hear that humming starting again from the forest, getting louder, closer. The tactical team heard it too, and I saw fear flash across their faces. Real fear, the kind professionals shouldn't show. "Secure them now," the leader barked. "We need to be out of here in 2 minutes." They zip-tied our hands and dragged us toward the SUVs. I was thrown into the back of one vehicle with Ellen, while Austin was separated into another. The doors slammed shut, and the convoy started moving immediately, driving fast and reckless on the deteriorating road. Through the tinted windows, I caught glimpses of figures emerging from the forest. Those tall, wrong-proportioned shapes from last night, dozens of them, stepping into the clearing we were leaving behind. The humming grew deafening even inside the sealed vehicle, and the driver was sweating, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, accelerating harder. We made it maybe 3 miles before the first SUV in the convoy stopped suddenly. I couldn't see what happened from my position, but the driver in our vehicle cursed and hit the brakes hard. The tactical team was shouting into radios, coordinating something, and then I heard gunfire. Automatic weapons firing in controlled bursts, then panicked full auto sprays, then screaming. Our driver threw the SUV into reverse and started backing up at dangerous speed, but something landed on the hood. One of those figures moving too fast to see clearly, slamming against the windshield hard enough to crack it. The driver lost control, and we crashed into the trees on the side of the road. The impact threw Ellen and me against our seat belts hard enough to bruise. The driver was slumped over the wheel, unconscious or dead, blood running down his face from where his head had hit the side window. Ellen was screaming my name, her hands still zip-tied behind her back, unable to brace herself. I struggled against my restraints, the plastic cutting into my wrists, and managed to get my hands in front of me by dislocating my thumb. Painful as hell, but necessary. I used my teeth to work at the zip tie, finally snapping it, then freed Ellen the same way. Outside, the gunfire had stopped, replaced by sounds that were worse. Wet tearing noises and screaming that cut off abruptly. I kicked out the back window of the SUV, helped Ellen climb through, and we dropped to the ground outside. The forest was chaos. The lead vehicle was on its side, on fire, bodies scattered around it in pieces that didn't look like they'd been killed by bullets. The second SUV had managed to turn around and was speeding away back toward the clearing, leaving us behind. And everywhere, those figures were moving through the trees, pursuing the fleeing tactical team members who'd scattered into the forest. I grabbed Ellen's arm and pulled her in the opposite direction, away from the road, deeper into the woods. We needed to find Austin, but survival came first. We ran blind through dense undergrowth, branches whipping our faces and arms. Behind us, I could hear pursuit. Those measured footsteps, always exactly 4 seconds apart, never faster but somehow always getting closer. Ellen was sobbing as she ran, asking about Austin, begging me to go back for him. I told her we'd circle around, find him, but right now we had to get distance. The forest seemed to go on forever. No landmarks I recognized, my professional knowledge of this region completely useless. Either the landscape had changed drastically since I'd surveyed it, or we'd somehow gotten turned around and were miles from where I thought we were. We stumbled into a ravine, sliding down a steep embankment and landing in a creek bed that was mostly dry except for a trickle of water. Ellen twisted her ankle in the fall, cried out in pain, and I helped her into a sitting position against a rock. I could hear those footsteps above us, moving along the ridge, searching. We pressed ourselves against the embankment and didn't move, barely breathing, praying they'd pass us by. The footsteps stopped directly above our position. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then something dropped into the ravine 20 feet from us. One of the figures landing in a crouch that no human could achieve, absorbing the impact with legs that bent wrong. In daylight, I could finally see what these things actually were, and I wished I couldn't. They looked human from a distance, but up close the illusion fell apart. The skin was gray and waxy, stretched too tight over bones that didn't have the right number of joints. The face had eyes and a mouth and a nose, but they were positioned slightly off, like someone had assembled a human face from memory rather than reality. And the hands, those impossibly long fingers, ended in what looked like surgical scalpels instead of fingernails, metallic and sharp. It turned its head toward us with movements that were too fluid, too smooth, neck rotating further than any spine should allow. Ellen made a small sound of terror, and that was enough. The thing oriented on us immediately and started walking forward with that mechanical precision. 4 seconds per step. I grabbed a rock and threw it, hitting the thing in the chest. It didn't react, didn't slow, just kept coming. I picked up a larger rock, preparing to fight even though I knew it was hopeless, when we heard Austin's voice from above. "Dad, Aunt Ellen." Not Dad. I wasn't Austin's father, but in his panic he defaulted to the term. He was at the edge of the ravine with one of the tactical team members who'd somehow survived, both of them armed with rifles they'd taken from the dead. They opened fire on the figure approaching us, bullets tearing through its torso, and it finally stopped. Stumbled backward. Fell, but it didn't die. It lay on the ground with massive holes in its chest and abdomen, and it started to repair itself. The wounds closed, tissue regenerating at visible speed, gray flesh knitting back together like watching a time-lapse video of healing. Within 30 seconds, it was standing again, completely undamaged, resuming its approach. "Run!" the tactical team member shouted, firing again, aiming for the head this time. The bullets destroyed the thing's skull, dropped it again, but we all knew it would just regenerate. Austin helped Ellen and me climb out of the ravine while his companion provided covering fire, and we ran together, all 5 of us now, through forest that seemed to have no end. The tactical team member, he said his name was Garrett, ex-military working private security, explained as we ran that his team had been monitoring this site for years. The bunkers contained subjects from an experiment that went wrong in the 80s, something involving genetic modification and chemical exposure, trying to create perfect soldiers. The subjects had become something else, something that couldn't die and didn't need food or sleep, and they'd been locked away and forgotten until we'd accidentally freed them by our presence, triggering the door locks to fail. Why weren't there warning signs? Ellen demanded between gasps for air. Garrett said the project was so classified that acknowledging its existence with warning signs would have drawn more attention than letting it sit hidden and forgotten. We'd been running for maybe 20 minutes when we broke through the tree line into another clearing, and my heart sank. It was the same clearing we'd started in, the same bunkers, the same pond, my van still sitting there with its cut battery cables. We'd run in a circle somehow, or the forest had redirected us, or we were trapped in something that didn't follow normal geography. "That's impossible," I said, my engineer's mind refusing to accept it. We ran in a straight line. We should be miles away, but there was the van, there were the bunkers, and emerging from the forest behind us were at least 20 of those figures, walking in perfect synchronization, herding us back to the center of their territory. Austin still had his phone, and he'd been filming everything. The crash, the creatures, our flight through the forest. He said if we didn't make it out, at least there'd be evidence, proof of what happened here. Ellen told him to stop being morbid. We were going to survive. We had to survive. But even she didn't sound convinced. Garrett was checking his ammunition, down to his last magazine, and he said once that was gone, we had nothing to fight with except rocks and sticks. The figures were closing in from all sides now, tightening the circle, and I realized this was it. After 59 years of life, after a career spent building roads and planning infrastructure and believing the world followed logical rules, I was going to die in a forest that broke all those rules, killed by things that shouldn't exist, and nobody would ever know what really happened to us. Garrett made a decision without consulting us. He told Austin to take Ellen and me into one of the bunkers, seal ourselves inside, and wait for evacuation that might never come. He'd hold off the creatures as long as his ammunition lasted, buy us time to hide. Austin argued, said we should stick together, but Garrett was already moving toward the approaching figures, firing controlled bursts that dropped them temporarily, but didn't stop them permanently. "Go," he shouted, and we went, running for the nearest bunker while gunfire echoed across the clearing. Inside the bunker was worse than I'd imagined. The concrete walls were covered in scratch marks, thousands of them, overlapping and deep, evidence of decades of whatever had been imprisoned here, trying to claw its way out. The floor drain in the center was crusted with dried blood and tissue. And the smell, chemicals and decay, and something else, something wrong on a molecular level that made my eyes water. Ellen immediately started dry heaving, and Austin pulled her to the far corner where the smell was slightly less intense. I found the door's internal lock mechanism, a heavy bolt that slid into place with a metallic clang, sealing us inside. The gunfire outside stopped. Silence. Then screaming, Garrett's voice, high and terrified and brief. Then silence again. They'd gotten him. We were alone. Austin held Ellen while she cried, and I examined the bunker's interior looking for anything useful, any way out besides the single door we'd just locked. There was nothing, just bare concrete and those horrible scratch marks and the drain that suggested things had been done in here that I didn't want to imagine. My phone was gone, lost somewhere during our escape. Austin's phone was down to 10% battery, and we had no signal anyway. We were trapped in a concrete box waiting to die. Hours passed. We heard them outside, scratching at the door, that humming sound vibrating through the walls. Austin's phone died. The light from the open drain hole, apparently they connected to some underground system that led in minimal daylight, was the only illumination. Ellen had gone quiet, past the point of panic and shock. Austin was still trying to be optimistic, saying rescue would come, someone would notice we were missing. I didn't have the heart to tell him that nobody knew where we were, that I'd deliberately chosen the most remote location possible to prove some stupid point about real camping. We were going to die here, and it was entirely my fault. As darkness fell outside, the scratching intensified. They were working on the door systematically, coordinated effort to break through. The metal was thick, but not thick enough to hold forever. I estimated we had maybe until midnight before they breached the seal. Austin asked what we should do, and I didn't have an answer. Fight with our bare hands? Surrender and hope they killed us quickly? Try to rush through them when they finally broke in, make a run for it in the dark? All terrible options. Ellen spoke for the first time in hours, her voice hoarse and broken. I'm sorry I came on this trip. I should have stayed home. Should have let you two do your bonding thing without me. I told her not to apologize, that I was the one who'd brought us here, that everything that happened was my responsibility. The door started to buckle around 11 o'clock. The bolt was holding, but the frame was giving way, concrete cracking, metal warping. We could see their fingers working through the gap, those scalpel-like nails cutting through solid metal like it was cardboard. Austin grabbed my arm and said, "When they get in, run for the van. I'll distract them. You and Mom just run." I told him absolutely not. We weren't sacrificing anyone, but he wasn't listening. He'd positioned himself by the door, ready to charge through whatever came in first. My nephew, 26 years old with his whole life ahead of him, preparing to die so his mother and uncle might survive. I'd never been more proud and more horrified at the same time. The door exploded inward at 11:47 p.m. I know because I was staring at my watch when it happened, counting down seconds. The creatures poured in like water, and Austin charged them, actually managed to knock two of them down through sheer momentum before they overwhelmed him. Ellen screamed and lunged for her son, and I grabbed her, pulled her back, dragged her toward the drain hole even though it was too small for an adult to fit through. We fought while Austin disappeared under a pile of those things, still fighting, still buying us seconds. The drain hole was about 18 inches across. Ella might fit if we broke her bones. I might fit if I did the same. It was insane, but it was the only option left. I shoved Ellen head first into the drain, heard her scream as her shoulders compressed, and pushed harder than I've ever pushed anything. Something broke. Her collarbone probably, but she slid through, dropped into whatever was below. The creatures were turning toward me now, finished with Austin, and I didn't look at what they'd done to him. Couldn't. I squeezed into the drain hole, felt my shoulders grate against concrete, felt ribs crack, kept pushing down through agony and terror. Hands grabbed my legs, those scalpel fingers cutting into my calves, and I kicked hard, felt one finger snap off of my leg muscle, but I was through, falling into darkness and landing in water. Underground stream, flowing fast. Ellen grabbed me, and we let the current take us, swept away into complete darkness beneath the mountain, leaving Austin behind, leaving Garrett behind, leaving everything behind except the desperate animal need to survive. The underground river carried us for what felt like hours. We crashed into rocks, tumbled over underwater falls, nearly drowned a dozen times. My broken ribs screamed with every breath. Ellen's shoulder was destroyed, her arm hanging at a sickening angle. But we stayed together, stayed conscious, stayed alive. Eventually the current slowed, and we could feel gravel under our feet, could pull ourselves onto a bank. We were in a cave, natural limestone formations, and there was light ahead, actual daylight coming through a cave entrance. We crawled toward it, barely human anymore, just broken animals seeking escape. We emerged on a mountainside miles from where we'd started. The cave mouth opened onto a logging road, and we collapsed on the gravel, unable to go any further. A truck found us 6 hours later, loggers starting their morning shift. They called for help, for ambulances, and we were airlifted to a hospital in Missoula. The official story was that we'd been in a hiking accident, separated from our group, injured in a fall. Nobody asked about Austin. Nobody asked where we'd really been. When the police came to take statements, all our answers were vague, trauma-induced memory loss, nothing that could be verified or investigated. Austin's body was never found. The search and rescue teams couldn't locate the clearing with the bunkers. I couldn't even find it on maps anymore, like it had been erased. The Forest Service road I'd followed didn't appear on any current maps, and when I insisted I'd surveyed it 30 years ago, my own employment record showed I'd never worked in that region. History had been rewritten, or I'd never been there at all, or I'd slipped into some version of Montana that existed parallel to the real one. Ellen believes we were in some kind of government black site that's been scrubbed from existence. I think it was something worse, something that our understanding of reality can't accommodate. It's been 4 months. Ellen moved to Florida, as far from Idaho and Montana as she could get. She doesn't speak to me anymore, blames me for Austin's death, and she's right too. I blame myself too. I quit engineering, sold my house, and moved into a small apartment in Boise where I sit and remember my nephew's last moments of courage. I have nightmares every night about those creatures, about the bunkers, about that clearing that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I hear humming outside my window, that same rising and falling pitch, and I know they found me somehow. They're waiting, patient. Eventually they'll come for me, finish what they started, and maybe I deserve it. Maybe that's justice for the arrogance that led me to drag my family into hell. I keep Austin's phone. They found it in the wreckage of one of the SUVs, still functional somehow. The videos he took are all there, proof of what we saw, but they're corrupted, just static and distorted sound. The only clear frame is a still image of me looking at the camera, and behind me in the darkness, one of those creatures standing with its hand on my shoulder. I don't remember that moment. Don't remember it touching me. But there it is, permanent evidence that something came back with me. Something that's still here, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to finish the harvest.